Hi, this is Rhonda and Brian talking to you again about portfolio management. And in this video, we'll be talking about our seventh and final principle that we align to when we do portfolio management, and that's about time boxes and time boxes needed at all levels.
So when we discuss time boxes, I want to make sure we understand what a time box is and why we care about it. So a time box is, think of it as a container, and you actually are going to do some work, produce something that's valuable, and you do it within these containers. And the reason we have the time box is because we want to make sure that at the end of this thing, we check to make sure we're headed in the right direction. If we have certain goals, so we want to accomplish something by a certain time box in, and we want to make sure that at the end of it, we're forcing you to look at, did we do what was expected, right? And if we did, then we're probably on track. And if we didn't, then we may need to adjust our approach. So it forces an assessment to be done periodically to make sure we actually revisit our approach and change our strategy if necessary. What are your thoughts, Rhonda?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're talking about, Brian, is something different than might be surprising to some people. We're familiar with time boxes at the teams, where teams might be doing Scrum, they have their sprint, it's time box, they execute, make their commitment, execute, and then at the end have their retrospective. What we're saying is that we need to have time boxes and the same type of discipline of the commitment and the review and that feedback loop happening at all layers of the outcome structure. So those ceremonies and those practices need to happen up and down that whole entire hierarchy.
And this is big. And the reason it's so big, I think it's ironic, right? Even though this is a big paradigm shift, I find it ironic because the concept of milestones has been around for decades. And so a milestone was always composed of three components, and I call it the GED, right? A goal, an evaluation criteria, and a date in which you evaluate. And so with the milestone, again, you're always trying to mitigate risks. It's the risk that I won't complete what I'm supposed to complete on time for my end goal. I want to achieve the outcome that I want to achieve by this end goal. And I always want to mitigate that risk by checking to make sure that I've completed at least a piece of it by these interim dates. And that's how milestones get formed. Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind is that with the goal portion of our GED, the goal represents a change in the state, the characteristics from what you start with to what you desire. Because again, this should correspond to the characteristics of your outcomes. So I have a certain state that I have right now, and I want to actually have a different outcome, which is really a change in the state that I currently have, right? So those will be the goals that I have in my milestone. And there should be some objective criteria that I can actually use to evaluate whether I reached that outcome, right? And then finally, the D in my GED is, here's the date in which I have to do this assessment. I have to look at it, and I'm expecting that I've actually changed the characteristics, I've reached the goal. And Rhonda, you want to pick up on this part?
Yeah, so it is so important that as you're going through this whole process, that you're looking at your outputs, your deliverables, which are shown by the Gantt chart portion of this slide, where you're looking at the different outputs happening, the deliverables happening over time, and then looking at your outcome milestones in relationship to those. So there should be a relationship between the outputs and the outcomes. And those milestones are you're expecting something to happen in your outcomes. Now, we also have the decision checkpoints in there. And those decision checkpoints are actually special milestones where you've decided ahead of time, at the very beginning, you've decided that there's some certain checkpoints that need to happen where a decision is going to be made, where you've made that analysis up front or the criteria up front, where you said, if something happens, if this happens, then we're going to take this action, or we're going to make this conclusion, and then have either continue on course, pivot, some decision is going to be made. So this is where you take the outcomes and align it with the expected outputs, and be able to monitor and see those in conjunction with each other.
And I love this chart because lots of times in many organizations, people don't examine the connections between the outputs and the outcomes. And what they'll do is I'll have a chart that looks at my outputs. Did I produce these things on time? Right? And they're strictly judging that, but without looking at, well, I produced these things on time. Am I on track to produce the outcomes? Without having that piece of it, it becomes pointless because you don't even know whether or not producing those outputs are even worth it. Right. So having a chart like this that links the two is downright essential.
Right. And this is tying this into the time box concept. This is where it gets really critical. And what I like to do and find as a great practice that works so well with the clients that I've worked with is that I have purposely put my decision checkpoints at quarterly boundaries, because there's a level of the hierarchy, and we have it with our sub-initiatives. If you look at the Brian and Rhonda hierarchy, is on a quarterly basis, we want to have a commitment of work, a commitment of the outcomes, expected outcomes, and at the end of each quarter, making sure we're having a decision checkpoint, so that we look at those, the metrics and the decisions that we defined ahead of time, and making sure we're actually taking the action on those. Now, if the information is coming in ahead of even the decision checkpoint, and you already realize that that there needs to be a pivot, or you need to make a change, you don't need to wait till the end of the quarter. You can go ahead and execute as you know you need to, or make a pivot as you need to. But those quarterly decision checkpoints are there to ensure you don't forget. We need that discipline. We need that activity or that event to happen to ensure we're taking the action that we defined up front.
Absolutely. And so in essence, having the milestone dates, it produces a forcing function to ensure that the teams, the management committee, you're forced to review and assess where you are. So you're at least considering whether you should make a decision to change something in a certain interval. And I have a basic rule, and the basic rule is that the riskier something is, right, the greater the likelihood that you're going to mess something up, that you're not going to achieve the outcome, the more frequent you should have the milestones. So if I'm in a place where I'm doing something, been doing it for years, got great personnel, they're experts at it, I trust them. I don't need to check as much. So maybe I'm just using the quarterly checkpoints at the highest levels. But if this is a new venture, it's out of our depth, we've never done this before, we're trying some things that are experimental, it's more risky, the impact is bigger, then maybe I'm creating more milestones. Maybe I'm having milestones every month, or every 2 weeks, or even once a week. So again, the greater the risk that you can veer off and do something wrong, the more you need to reevaluate, the more milestones, more frequently I'm going to create.
Right. And this type of practice, Brian, it really is two things that come to my mind. One is discipline. And really, portfolio management requires a lot of discipline. And having time boxes helps reinforce that and helps put a structure around that type of discipline. And the second thing is accountability, is we are holding folks in different roles accountable for the outputs and the outcomes that are desired. And that's part of the definition of their job, is being accountable for these things. And the time boxes gives us those checkpoints to make sure we're on track for achieving those things. And if not, then those responsible need to come up with a method or a pivot to get there. And it's really about accountability, responsibility, and having that structure around it.
I can say just from watching when you've actually gone into organizations and actually developed a cadence for each of the levels and when they have to check to make sure that they assess the outcomes that they're responsible for producing, it added such a degree of clarity for their positions, and it really focused on the results that it completely changed the culture. And I think that combined with the other principle we discussed, time boxing is one of those essential pieces that if you want to be successful, you need to create the time boxes, create the cadence from when you're going to check, and then make management responsible for checking to making sure we're on track. Any last thoughts before we round out the last video on the last principle?
Again, as you said, Brian, if people take these seven key things that we've outlined in our videos and put them into practice, I am absolutely positive they will see a difference in their organizations and a difference in what is actually happening in those agile transformations, and people will really see results. We've seen it over and over again. It requires a lot, though, and there's a lot of things that need to come into play here, but just taking these 7 points and putting them to practice, you will get results.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and watching. And although this is the last video on the principles, don't be too distressed. We're going to create more videos on different topics that you've actually requested of us. But thank you for participating, and we'll catch you next time.